Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for standing by, and welcome to the LexisNexis Risk Solutions Navigate Complex AML Compliance Challenges webinar. Here are a few brief announcements. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. If you have a question during the presentation, please use the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded. If you're having any issues with the presentation or media player, please press F5 on your PC to refresh your screen. Today's presenters are Douglas Wolfson. Douglas is the Director, Financial Crime Compliance for LexisNexis Risk Solutions in Asia. Headquartered in Hong Kong, he drives the strategy and product development of the risk tools used by the biggest banks in the world that help to mitigate financial crime compliance issues. Doug has 18 years of financial services, risk management, and international business experience. This includes leading risk management departments at the world's most recognizable financial institutions. Also speaking today is David Joie, Financial Crime Consultant, LexisNexis Risk Solutions. David has been in the risk and compliance domain for more than 8 years, while specializing in anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing, or AML-CTF. Over the years, David has been at the forefront when it comes to understanding each client's financial compliance needs. That's because he translates user requirements into solutions design and provides industry best practices to fulfill regional regulatory guidelines. David is a trusted advisor for more than 100 customers in the Asia-Pacific region, with operational hubs in Australia, Singapore, Hong Kong, and India. And now over to you, Doug. Welcome.
Great. Thank you very much, Mary, and delighted to hear your voice again. That means it's webinar time again. I'm very excited to be back. For those of you who joined us last week for the Know Your Customer and Customer Due Diligence webinar with Viv Chatras of Deutsche Bank, thank you very much for coming back. We're very excited to have you here. What we want to talk about today is an extension of last week's webinar. We had a lot of questions and comments around topics, and so we wanted to expand on some of them for you, especially because of how tightly intertwined KYC, due diligence, and anti-money laundering is. A lot of stopping money laundering is knowing who your customers are and making sure that they're behaving correctly. So, taking a cue from you guys and the questions that you've raised, we're going to talk today about AML Technology Trends, Centralization versus Decentralization, data privacy, and then, of course, AML, CFT in the times of COVID-19. And we have, at the end, we're going to have a Bridger demo. Now, that's going to come at, I think, about 10:30 this morning. My colleague David is going to give you a run through our screening solution Bridger so that you can see what screening solutions look like, and you can take a lot of what we discuss and see it put into practical application. We wanted to show you a lot of what we're talking about today in a practical solution. So, with no further ado, let's get started. Talking about AML technology trends. Now, we were asked at the end of the webinar last week, what technology trends do you see, and how do you see technology driving AML forward? And to me, the most obvious solution is digital. Everything is becoming digital, and as we discussed last week, and we're going to go into a bit more depth this week, it's about straight-through processing. It's about trying to take human decision-making out of the process as much as possible until you reach the point that a human decision has to be made. Now, we're going to discuss artificial intelligence. We're going to discuss machine learning. We're going to discuss how computers are helping us to make better decisions. But at this point, humans make the best decisions when presented with evidence, and intuition, logic have to be used. Humans are still better than the machines. We're going to talk about eKYC, digital KYC, KYC of devices, and integration through API and the workflow. And the reason for this is all very straightforward. What you need to be thinking about when you're building that KYC process, when you're trying to reduce the complexity in your AML compliance program, is how do you take human hands out of it as much as possible? You want to reduce manual labor wherever you can. Straight-through processing is one way to discuss it. Exception processing is another one. And what exception processing is humans only get involved in the exception cases. So if somebody has a name match that cannot easily be, overturned or can't be easily ruled out as a false positive, that's where humans get involved. If there is an ID that you've scanned and the picture isn't very good or the match isn't clear, that's where humans need to get involved. And so what we're trying to do is, talk to you and work with you to help reduce human hands in the process. So for those of you who joined last week, you would have seen this slide. I wanted to bring this slide up again today so we could go into each one of these steps in a little bit more detail, because we sort of glossed over it. We talked about straight-through processing. We talked about exception processing, but we didn't really talk about each of the steps. And so what I wanted to do was go through this in a bit more depth. So if you look at a KYC process, there are sort of 5 or 6 steps and then ongoing monitoring that needs to be done. The first step is digital KYC. I'll go through a bit more of that in a minute. And then once you've done the digital KYC, you need to start looking at the individuals. And you start by looking at their ID and passport. Does it match the photo that they've given you? Does it match? Is the passport a real passport? Does it seem like it's been faked? Are you comfortable with the documentation that they've provided? Then you need to do a full identity check, and then you screen them for sanctions, adverse media, PEPs. Are they a PEP? You do all this screening. Then after those 4 steps are done, it goes into ongoing monitoring. And I'll talk about ongoing monitoring at the end. But if we start with digital KYC, what is digital KYC? This is a new term, and it's a term that we're really pushing because we see it as incredibly valuable. Given the move to digitization that's happened over the past sort of 3 to 4 years, especially in Asia Pacific, especially in places like Southeast Asia, but now also in Hong Kong, where we're seeing, virtual banks come up as well. It's been in e-commerce for years. This is where you need to do a KYC on an individual, and you need to do it online. You're not meeting them. You're doing an eKYC. Before you even look at who that person is, you want to check to see, is this device or is this person's connection, are they at risk? Are they bringing a risk? Has this device ever been connected to frauds or muling schemes or other risky behavior that you don't want anything to do with? This allows you in the first step, before you've even tried to onboard them as an individual, this allows you to look at them and say, okay, this device is risky. We're immediately going to put them in a different bucket. And when we talk about exception monitoring, that's when you start to look at them more closely with your investigators. So before you even look at the person, you're looking at their devices. You're looking at their internet connections. You're looking at the countries that they are connecting to your portal from to understand whether or not this person poses a risk. If an IP address pops up for Iran or Cuba or Syria or North Korea, and you're a business that does transactions in US dollars, you know there's potential risk there, and you want to know that immediately. If there's a device that's been connected to fraud in the past, you want to know that immediately, and you stick them in an exception queue. Now, maybe you decide to reject them outright. That's also a possibility, and is definitely something that you could do. but it's something that you need to know before you even start to do due diligence on the individual. What's the next step? Okay, the device is passed, you're comfortable with the device, it immediately moves into the next step, which is asking the person to take a picture of the front and back of their ID card or of the picture page of their passport, and you check to see whether or not it's an authentic passport or an ID card, and you have a selfie. And what you do is you check that selfie versus the picture in the identity document, and you check the information to make sure that it's authentic. A lot of these technologies these days have optical card readers as well, character readers. So what they can do is they rip the information straight off the identity card or straight off the passport, and then from there you can take that information and feed it directly downstream into your full identity verification system. Now, when I say directly downstream, that's the straight-through processing that I'm talking about. If you go from digital KYC and say, okay, I'm comfortable with this device, I'm going to lift the gate and let them through to ID or passport verification, that means that you're doing straight-through processing. Ripping through OCR the information off of that identity card or passport and moving it onto full identity verification, what that means is that you're doing straight-through processing again, and you don't have to worry about someone taking the information, inputting it in the next system, and having some sort of human error along the way where they misinput information. So what is full identity verification? That's verifying addresses, that's verifying potentially phone numbers to make sure that the information that this person has given you is correct. And there are plenty of tools out there that allow you to check the information that is coming off that identity card versus government database, credit bureau databases, and allow you to do that check to make sure the information they're giving you is correct and they're not trying to give you false information, which of course is another red flag. From there, assuming they pass that identity verification check, you move on to sanctions, adverse media, enforcements, and PEP screening. And this is the step we're going to give you a little bit of a demo with Dave later on. But again, you can take that information from the original OCR and the ID card and passport. You can put it through that sanction screening, that adverse media screening, and you can feed it immediately through. And if there are no matches, or if the matches can immediately be knocked off as false positives, then what you've done is you've created an entire process that is straight-through processing, and it allows you to take humans out of the equation. When you take people out of the equation, you can pass people through in essentially less than a minute. When you take out the time it takes them to screen their ID card and their passport, it allows you to onboard customers quicker, and it allows you to onboard customers more correctly. From that point, you have all of their information in their system, and you can do continuing periodic checks with that sanctions and adverse media screening and the enforcements and the PEP screening. You can do those ongoing checks, whether you do them daily, weekly, monthly, that's entirely up to you. But you can do those checks, and you can also continue to do that digital monitoring. So that digital KYC you did at the beginning, you can do that every single time that they log on to your account, and they can do it. You can do it anytime they do a payment. It's really valuable to make sure that you continue to know who your customer is as they continue to do business. Because the better you know your customer, the more you know when there's anomalous behavior. And we're going to talk a bit about anomalous behavior later, but this allows you to know when your customer is behaving differently than you're expecting them to. And so this is really important, right? And if I take a step back and I talk about the screening and the way that you do the screening and gaining that operational efficiency, and what Dave is going to be showing you in a little bit is about the false positives and false positive dilemma, right? You see here, when you do screening, and those of you who are involved in screening, those of you who are in compliance departments or in onboarding departments, you can see about 75% of the time you get no match and those people go straight through, and that's straight through processing. Unfortunately, about 24 to 25% of the time you get false positives. And that's really the scourge of our entire compliance community, because you're spending a lot of time trying to investigate people who, at the end of the day, are not PEPs, are not financial criminals, have had nothing in adverse media. And so these are people that you want to do business with. However, you're stuck in a place where you're investigating and expending resources on them, even though there's no risk to them. That final sort of 1%, it's actually probably even less than 1%, is an actual true positive. And these are the PEPs, and these are the financial criminals that are higher risk, and you either don't want to do business with, or you want to put more controls around the way they do business. Now, PEPs get lumped in with people who are sanctioned, with people who have enforcements against them, people who are in adverse media. PEPs are not in the same risk category. There's a reason why they have their separate risk category. You need to be able to deal with them, and they're allowed to have accounts. They're perfectly legitimate people doing business, but there is a higher risk area with them because they are politically exposed. They're either politicians or associates of politicians, and so you need to be able to do business with these people. But the problem is you need to be able to reduce your false positives as much as possible. And the key thing here when we talk about reducing those false positives as much as possible is making sure that you have good data, you have good analytics, and that you're doing everything you can to use that data and that analytics correctly. You often hear the phrase, garbage in, garbage out. When I was in banking, this was a phrase we used a lot because we knew if you have bad data, you were going to get bad results. And the reason for this is it doesn't really matter how good your analytics are. If the inputs are bad, the outputs are going to be bad. When you hear about winemaking, to use an analogy, winemakers always talk about themselves, well, the best winemakers talk about themselves as stewards of the grapes. They say they can't make a good wine if they don't have good grapes. This is the same about data. This is the same about compliance. This is the same about screening. If you don't have good data, you're going to struggle to have good results. And so this is one of the key complexities, especially in major banks. There is a lot of bad data. There are a lot of systems. For those of you who joined last week, you might remember my slide with the servers and the arrows pointing all over the place. This is what creates bad data. When you have a straight-through processing approach, when you have optical character readers taking the information and feeding it directly downstream to your banking systems or your e-commerce systems, that's where you get good data, right? And you can use artificial intelligence and you can use machine learning on those algorithms, on that data. However, the results are still only going to be good as that original data. And I think as you start to talk about artificial intelligence and you start to talk about machine learning, these are incredible tools. We use them ourselves, and we use them to try to do analytics to reduce those false positives because, again, the false positives are the biggest waste of time and resources in the industry. But what you need to make sure is that you're doing those data analytics correctly. A colleague of mine, T.S. Lim, who some of you have maybe come across, I promised him a shout out in this deck. He and I had a really long conversation yesterday about data blindness versus data torture. And this is how exciting our jobs are, by the way. This is what we talk about, data blindness and data torture. Data blindness is a situation where you have so much data that you really can't get any insights out of it because you're overwhelmed and you don't know what to do. For those of you who have ever been to a restaurant where they say, oh, we make pizza, oh, and we make barbecue, and oh, we have Chinese food, and oh, we have Malaysian food, and oh, we have Singaporean food, and oh, we have Korean food. It's overwhelming, right? And you don't know what you want to select because there's so many choices. You don't know what to do. This is very similar, where you have so much data that you don't know what to do with it. On the flip side, data torture is where you are trying to fit the data to the results that you want. And this is one of the biggest issues in scientific study, is that the results have to fit the data and not the other way around. You cannot have the data fit the results that you're looking for, because that's when mistakes happen. When we speak to our team, and TS and I spend a lot of time speaking to our data analytics team, they're based in the United States. When we speak to our data analytics team, it's as much about their rigorous process and what they're finding in terms of results as it is about what the results are themselves. And this is really important, because if the results are to reduce false positives and they find a solution that reduces false positives, that's great. But if they also ignore the fact that it increases true positives, that's really problematic. And so what we need to make sure is that when you're using that data and you're trying to reduce the false positives, is that you're not creating a line that's fit. You're not creating that results that are fit to the results that you want, rather than the results as they're expected, as the calculations make them. Because if you use the true results, you can then tweak your models to try to reduce your false positives while not increasing your false true positives. But at the same time, ignoring true positives, but at the same time you have to make sure that you're not overfitting the line. So the data is essential, good data is essential, good analytics are essential, and going in with the correct approach, the correct scientific method is also important. And when we look at our data, I know we have an editorial review board, and we discussed this a bit last week, who makes sure that our data is appropriate, whether someone should be in the list, someone should not be in the list. That's not for us to decide. That's for the news, the sanctions list, the enforcement list. That's for them to decide. That's not for us to decide. We're just here to be stewards of good data. The next subject that I want to speak to, and I want to make sure that we finish with enough time for Dave to do his demo, is centralization versus decentralization. Now, this is a subject that we discussed last week a bit, and Viv was very clear about how centralization is better than decentralization, but this is really driven by country-specific regulations. If we look at somewhere like China, where privacy laws and the network security law is such that data must be kept on shore, and in many cases must be kept in the servers in a specific company, you cannot have centralization, and so it forces decentralization. However, when the regulations don't force decentralization, centralization is always preferred. And as you can see, we've put it on the slide here. It forces standardization. Standardization allows the repetition of tasks, and repetitive tasks can be handled by computers, and as we discussed with straight-through processing, this guarantees the same work is done every single time. The same decision is done. There's no input of data from one system to another. The level of quality of work is the same every single time, and when that happens, you can create straight-through processing, and you can create exception-based processing, which speeds up processing and improves the experience for your clients, and it improves the experience for your staff as well. You asked us to talk about data privacy. I mean, data privacy, as you know, is obviously also driven by regulation. In Asia Pacific, we have the PDPO here in Hong Kong, the PDPC in Singapore, the NSL in China, the proposed PDPB in India, amongst others. And one of the major issues that we're concerned, and this goes to GDPR as well, is when done incorrectly, it drives data localization. And we oppose data localization because that creates decentralization, and decentralization creates inefficiency, but we support data privacy. And so how can you create data privacy without data localization? The key ways are encryption and anonymization. If you're encrypting and you're anonymizing the data, then it makes it very difficult, even if somebody gets access illicitly and illegally to your database, it makes it very difficult to give them something to do with. We need to understand, and we work very regularly with regulators so that they understand that criminals are international. They're not held to country borders when they're using data. And so forcing companies and forcing vendors to be held to country borders when using data is problematic, because we can't use the analytics from one country versus the analytics in another country to understand how that data works together. And so it's problematic in that sense because it creates that decentralization and the inefficiency. We are of the view that compliance, fraud, and risk practitioners must be able to share data, and we are always supportive of clauses in laws like the PDPO, the PDBC, the GDPR that allow for the sharing of data across fraud exemption and financial crime exemption. These are key aspects of these legislations, because if you have a right to be forgotten and you're a criminal, you're always going to choose to be forgotten. And whatever a criminal is going to do, we don't want to allow them to do it. And so to be able to keep data, even after someone wants to be forgotten, to use for fraud and financial crime use cases is essential. Touching on, as I sort of start to finish up here, touching on life in the times of COVID-19, look, I think we've all seen it's led to a quickening of digitization, but the FATF has grasped onto that, and they've acknowledged that this has also led to an increase in fraud, cybercrime, and the digital exploitation of government funds. This means that banks, payment platforms, e-wallets, crypto exchanges, you need to be aware that money laundering risks are increasing. The processes that you may have used in the past might not be good enough now for the digital environment and digital climate, and you need to be more focused on these digital transactions and the digital money laundering risks. These are happening right now, and you need to be aware of them. It's really important that you have these EKYC, a strong EKYC process in place, because you may never meet your client in this new digital world, and you need to be prepared for their behavior. And so you need to be collecting the data about them, because, as I mentioned before, you need to be prepared for unexpected behavior. Whether it's unexpected devices connecting to known accounts, and again, that goes back to that ongoing monitoring after you've done digital KYC, or it's unexpected digital behavior around logins and payments, or it's unexpected behavior around payment sizes and frequencies. You have the ability to protect your clients here, and this is really important because, especially for retail clients, you don't want to be doing chargebacks. You don't want to be repaying your clients, putting money back into their accounts, because oftentimes that's where it ends up. So you need to make sure that you're doing as much as you can right now to navigate these more difficult climates. At this point, I'm going to take the opportunity to pass on to my colleague Dave. I am going to pass it over to him to do a demo of our system, Bridger Insight XG, along with our World Compliance Database, as I spoke about a little bit earlier. So please, Dave, and we will have a summary and a Q&A after Dave finishes his demo. So please, Dave, take it away.
Thank you so much, Douglas, for giving us an overview of what to take care of during the eKYC stage, as well as on the ongoing basis, what should we be looking out for. And how we are able to assist you here in LexisNexis Risk Solution is that we do provide a bridger platform to help identify potential red flags. Okay? And potential red flags is coming from the data of our proprietary work compliance. Okay? And that includes sanctions, enforcements, adverse media, and PEP risk. So all in all, we do have consolidated more than 30,000 data sources to put it in a comprehensive database. So when you are onboarding new customers or new users, you are able to use our platform to identify any potential red flags. Right. So thanks so much again for everyone for joining the webinar today. As we move along to our product demonstration, I would like to provide a view from a user's perspective, as you may imagine yourself as a KYC officer or operations officer or a compliance manager who is dealing with a new customer for the first time. Right? So as Doug has mentioned earlier on, what you will need to do is to do some kind of a verification and assessment. And this is where you will be capturing the users, the individuals' information, such as their name, date of birth, country of residence, phone number, gender, and so on. So this is a very simple layout of what it looks like as you go through the onboarding process to enter the individual's information. If ever you collected a bit more extensive information, for example, the previous address or passport numbers, you are able to add it on to this search page at any point in time. Right. So what we would like to show you today is just one example. If ever you are trying to onboard a new customer individual, you will be entering the person's name, date of birth, national ID, country of residence, phone numbers, and gender, for example. So as much as possible, it is best that you provide all you can collect from your end users. Okay? But if you look at the screen right here, only the yellow part indicates that this is a mandatory data field. So depending on your screening workflows, depending on information that you collect, you are able to customize the other data fields as mandatory. So this will ensure the users who are performing the onboarding, they are entering the appropriate information. So once this has been done on the search page, what you would need to do is click on the search button, and our bridger platform will perform a fuzzy algorithm matching. So this is done against our work compliance database, and from our database, it returned a couple of high-scoring individual profiles. High scoring being 100 out of 100, and this is looking at our fuzzy matching algorithm. Okay? At first glance, it may look like, hey, these are duplicates, but in actual fact, these are 9 unique individuals. So let me go a bit, explain a bit on how you would need to make an assessment on these search results. So obviously, we know 9 individuals came back as 100 of a high score, but most of them has been indicated as false positive by the bridger platform. So this is our false positive reduction capabilities. And let me go a bit more in depth one by one. So moving along, you will have indication of why these individuals are included in our database. And on the right-hand side, you give a quick analysis on the information that the user has entered, the name, gender, date of birth, country of residence, and a couple of quick analysis. So the blue ticks indicating it's very, very similar. Some similarity between what has been entered and what is on our profiles. So the red X obviously is indicating that, hey, the date of birth is too huge of a difference. So all in all, although there are 9 profiles that has been found in our database that are potentially high-risk red flags, but only one was not indicated as false positive. And this is where, as a Bridger user, you will be running a more in-depth analysis on the data that was provided under the input data against our work compliance profile. And on the right-hand side is our search core analysis to let the users know which data elements was matched or was a partial match. And very quickly, you will be able to identify this is a potential human trafficker, right? And that is coming from our adverse media risk category. So apart from this potential high-risk individual, our database also links up the individual's relationship. So these are his potential accomplices for the human trafficking crimes. And we will provide a short summary of the individual's profile, as well as the original data sources of where we compile this person's profile. So moving along, as a user, my job is slightly easier right now because Bridger has indicated to me the rest of the 100 high-score individuals' profiles are false positive. So I might be wondering, why is this indicated as a false positive? As I move on to the second profile, in the area over here, you will see that this is an automatic false positive, and that was determined by our intelligent match decision. So this is our supervised machine learning running in the background, and we have a couple of different rules to help give you a confidence score, between 0 to 10, to let users know, hey, this is very, very likely to be a false positive. So we have been enhancing our model, and at the moment it is at version 8, which comprises of more than 20 rules and criteria that users like you are able to make use of. So after which, moving along, there is the very similar analysis that you have weakness, input data versus the work compliance data, and this is the results. So imagine myself as the KYC officer or operations officer or compliance officer. I will be running my first round of review. I may be required to upload supporting documents about the individual, perhaps address proof or ID proof or some assessment. So you are able to upload the supporting document into the case management, and after which you can suggest to block this individual or suggest to accept this individual once this is found as a false positive. Assuming you do realize that, the person coming to you is a potential human trafficker, you will be indicating this as a true match and suggest to block. So what it does is you have the ability to escalate this case up to a manager with your findings and your comments. So once the user clicks apply, the case will be escalated up to the manager. And the manager will receive an email notification telling him or her, hey, there's a case that you will need to look into. Please come into Bridger and have a second round of review. So this is where we built in the maker checker or the 4 eyes principle. And fast forward, after the manager has performed his or her review, they can put the customers into a blacklist. Okay. So being in the blacklist, it is not recommended to open an account for this individual and then put the persons into your internal blacklist. You are able to indicate the reason why this is this individual is included into the blacklist, as well as any comments that you have. So that concludes a very basic flow when it comes to eKYC onboarding customers in the initial stage. And what you have witnessed is a manual process. Okay? So for the Bridger platform, it does include the API web services, and this will help automate the process during the eKYC evaluation. So whatever you have seen me click through in terms of entering the individual's information, in terms of indicating whether this is a false positive or true match, escalation, and finally closing off as a blacklisted person, all these actions we provide to you the corresponding API calls so that you can build in to enhance your overall eKYC process. Okay. So what happens next is perhaps after a couple of weeks or months, you will be required to pull out all those closed alerts or closed individuals. And you may want to pull out the report of what has been performed or decided for this person. So on our Bridger platform, it includes the audit trail of who did what and what was the final action. And you are able to download this as a report in a PDF, CSV, or XML format. So this is a very quick overview of how you will look like as a user to evaluate potential money laundering risk or financing terrorism risk. So there are a couple of different features that will help you along during the ongoing monitoring, okay, as well as streamlining your workflows according to what you want to achieve. So for today's sessions, we will be concluding this quick live demo, but I would like to have more time with you to show you how we can help you reduce the false positive, as well as streamlining your eKYC to meet your specific needs. Okay. With that, we are concluding the live demonstrations, and I'm handing back the screen to Douglas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dave. That was fantastic, and I think the really important thing here that we would like to get across to you is just understanding how implementing these solutions as part of your workflow is essential. It's this is a very good demonstration of how it can be implemented. Obviously, Dave is showing you in a manual way how to input these names, but this can all be streamlined. There are API calls, and these solutions can be delivered as part of your workflow. And it's really important because, again, when you create straight-through processing, when you create a streamlined workflow, it makes onboarding your clients faster, which does two things. First of all, it makes a happier client, but also it increases your opportunity for revenue. And it also makes your life easier because it makes your staff happier, it makes your compliance department happier, it makes your business lines happier, and it's essential to a good business, especially moving forward into the digital world. So just some key takeaways before we move into Q&A. And now we were asked last week, you asked, and so we're delivering. You asked for more time for Q&A, so we've sped up our presentation so we could deliver longer Q&A with you. So if you have any questions, please input them in the box on the screen. But the key takeaways as you're inputting those questions, look, the paradigm has shifted. I think we've all seen that, right? Digital is the present and the future, and compliance needs to catch up. I think for those of you who are in compliance departments, if you start speaking to the fraud department, you'll see how amazing the tools they are, how real-time, up-to-date, well, maybe near real-time they are, how they can stop fraud as it's happening. And on the compliance side, that just historically hasn't existed. And so compliance needs to catch up. And we can do that through eKYC. We can do that through ongoing digital KYC and ongoing digital monitoring. Data is essential, but it must be used appropriately if it's going to be used successfully. I think that that's very clear. As I said earlier, if you haven't heard it before, garbage in, garbage out. If you mention that to your colleagues, they likely will have heard it. You can't create anything without good data. And economy of scale are essential, right? Digital volumes are growing. Regulatory requirements are also growing, so you need to be more efficient in the way that you do business and the way that you process your customers, and this is really key to a successful business. And finally, with COVID, work from home, stay at home, and quickened digitization, this is increasing risk. It's forcing eKYC, and that risk must be managed. This is really important and essential for the way that you're going to have to do business going forward. And with that, I will pass it over back to Mary for your questions.
Thank you, Doug, and also thank you to you, David, for your presentation. Now it's time for the Q&A session, and all you have to do is type your questions into the Q&A box and then hit the submit button. We will get to as many questions as we can, and let's go ahead and get started with that first question. We'll make this one for you, Doug. What is the, let's see here, let me take a look. Being compliance people, how do you check IP addresses? And is there some simple way to do this? This is a question for you from Lila Afindi.
Yes, absolutely. There's a number of technologies out there that can be installed into a platform, into an app, into an online portal that allows you to check the IP address as it's coming in. And you can check the IP address to make sure that it's coming in from a country not only that isn't sanctioned per se, but also a country that you want to be doing and you can be doing business with. Say, for instance, crypto exchanges in Hong Kong may be getting a lot of business trying to come in from China, where there are a lot of regulations around crypto. And so they need to be aware of what country someone is coming in from. Now, that solves part of the problem, but it doesn't solve all of the problem, because even if you're checking those IP addresses, if someone is using a VPN or they're using a proxy, then there is the ability to sort of block where they're coming from potentially. And so you'll need technology that looks at other factors other than just your IP address or has proxy piercing technology. Obviously, it becomes more and more complicated, but for someone who's trying to evade sanctions, they're going to do whatever they can to try to obfuscate where they're coming from. And so there are absolutely technologies out there that can read the IP address and see where it's coming from. However, there are increasingly complex technologies that allow you to know so much more about those who those customers are and where they're coming from.
Thank you. David, here's a question for you. In fact, two people are asking the same thing. Is this a multilingual operation? And if so, how many languages does the system support? So this is from Andrew and Phyllis.
Sure. So for the Breacher platform, it does support a couple of different local languages for the users to make use of our solution. So in the Asia Pacific languages, we have Mandarin, Japanese, and perhaps some of you speak Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, French. So that is something that we can configure, or you as a user is able to change very, very quickly. And just to clarify, this is what the user sees, but in terms of the type of individual or customer names, languages that we support, because your customers may provide to you their names in Chinese or Japanese or Korean. So the languages we support when it comes to screening your customers is up to 59 languages.
Wow. I guess that's a couple languages then. Here's one for you, Doug. How do you ensure that garbage in, garbage out does not occur on political hit jobs where one political organization purposely flags their opponent organizations as fraudulent, even though the exact opposite is true? Question for you from Walter.
That is a fantastic question. Thank you very much. And I think what's really interesting about it is I'll give you from my perspective, and then I'll give you from an organization using our data's perspective, say a financial institution. So as I mentioned a bit earlier, we went in a bit more depth last week, but there's an editorial review board at our organization that looks at our world's compliance database, and they decide what are the requirements for somebody to be added to the database, what are the requirements for somebody to not be added to the database. And this includes things like sanctions lists. There are, say, if you're in the United States, there are individual states lists, there are countries lists, there are enforcement lists, but also adverse media. And adverse media looks at something like 30,000 different newspaper, journals, those types of sources, and they have to be legitimate sources. It's not Facebook or Twitter or things like that. And so their rules are very simple. If there is negative media or there's sanctions or there's an enforcement on an individual or on an entity, it generally has to be included in that country's list. And so if there was a political hit job, it's not really our position to say whether that's legitimate or not legitimate. It's on a list within a country, and so it gets added to the World Compliance Database. Now, within that country specifically, there might be a requirement for screening for those types of individuals, and so they might need to have it in there. What we would expect from our position is that companies would then use our database to the risk parameters of their own institution. And they would be able to make a decision on what types of individuals they would want to deal with. So if they viewed a country adding someone or an entity to a list as political and not as real risk, they could choose to continue to deal with that individual or entity. And that really comes down to the risk appetite of the organization. And so I would say as sort of the TLDR of that answer is that if a company needs to set their own risk appetite, and if they are willing to deal with individuals where they believe that someone has been added to the list because of political reasons and not because of real risk, that they can continue to go ahead and deal with that individual. But it's up to every individual organization. Every individual organization has their own risk appetite, and it came up again briefly last week, but we talked about building an enterprise risk assessment for a company. It's up to that risk assessment, your risk assessment of within the company, and deciding whether or not you want to deal with that individual or entity. But that's a fantastic question. Thank you, Walter.
David, here's one for you. Leela Vasi's back again. This takes care of one client. We have thousands of clients being onboarded daily. So how does the system help?
Yes, thanks, Mary. That's a good question. As we expect clients or customers and users themselves to onboard through the web portal or through your mobile apps, so this can be handled by our Bridger API. So what it means is it can be done in real time. When the customers and users themselves go through the application process, the information will automatically be flowed to the Bridger through API web services, and that will trigger the screening. And at the end of the assessment, the results, the potential high-risk categories will be returned back to your platform for further evaluation. So on a normal, typical flow, we expect this application to be straight through, and there will be very few cases that your users will need to make a further investigation or assessments. And this is just one way that Bridger can help you for automating the API web services. Unfortunately, today we ran out of time, and there is another feature which we call it automatic batch file screening, where essentially you will be passing to Bridger a file that contains thousands or hundreds of thousands of clients. And once Bridger receives that file, it will go through the queue and screen each of the clients and give you an assessment again. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you, David. Okay, one more for you, Doug, and then final comments. You discussed about the digitalization for AML compliance workflow. This seems very relevant to big organizations, but how about the smaller firms like startup and fintech? What can these companies do in terms of embracing technology, given the initial huge investment required?
This is a fantastic question. Thank you very much. And I think this is a place where smaller startups and fintech companies have an advantage. We discussed a bit earlier about how large organizations have very large infrastructures that have been built over time. And so that infrastructure is, potentially systems built on systems built on systems, and so is not particularly efficient. When you're starting from scratch, you can build a very efficient process. And what that allows you to do is reduce the number of systems, reduce the number of steps, which then reduce the cost. The LexisNexis Risk Solutions True Cost of Compliance report, which looked at the cost of compliance overall, but specifically at the cost of compliance versus technology spend, found that the more technology that's used and the more efficient technology that's used, that reduces the cost per capita of the compliance program, which means you can grow your compliance program significantly while growing the costs less. The marginal increase in cost is less as you grow the program. And so the ability to build that from scratch allows for significant cost savings. But thank you. That's a great question.
Thank you. And can you give us your final thoughts today, briefly?
Absolutely. Listen, I thank you all very much for joining us. We're very excited to be able to present to you today, again, the same as last week. We're really glad that you joined us and appreciate all of the questions. Key takeaways, again, the future is digitalization. You have to be on board with that or you're going to be left behind, and you have to make sure that your process is efficient and you start to remove human hands as much as possible. This is essential. I'd also note to please join us next week when Nick Turner from Steptoe & Johnson joins me to ask the question, how robust is your OFAC sanctions program?
Thank you, Doug and David, for your presentations, and also thanks to our audience. And if we didn't answer your question today, representatives from LexisNexis Risk Solutions will be in touch shortly with the information you need. And we'll also be sending the webinar recording within the next few days. Finally, please fill out our short survey before you leave the event. As Doug said, there are new LexisNexis Risk Solutions webinars scheduled every week on the latest financial crime compliance-related topics. So look for our invites and join us. Once again, thank you and have a great day.